as Trump's tariff chaos is continuing, we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show by Ashok Kumar, who is an associate professor of political economy at Birkbeck University of London. Ashok, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's an honor to have you here, and I have to say, the second Trump's first chart came out on reciprocal tariffs, and I know now we're moving things around, but I immediately thought of your book, Monopsony Capital, because seeing China, Bangladesh, Vietnam, all of these Southeast Asian countries, I was thinking so much of, your thesis there about the increased leverage for workers in a world where these U.S. supply chains were becoming more and more reliant on just a few producers. And I wonder to what extent you feel this, potential rise in worker power, at least potential worker power, and maybe more solidified supply chains that aren't as easily manipulated by global North countries are playing into the policies here and the thoughts.
Well, there's a few things, right? So very early on when, the system of globalization as we know it came into being, really, I think after the crisis of the 1970s, it was a system built for the benefit of large capital holding countries and the capitalists and corporations that were within those countries, so namely the US. So the entire system was basically built for them. So when Trump prioritizes talking about trade deficits, that doesn't really matter because the entire system is built to be traded in dollars, highly financialized, disintegrated, meaning, there's very powerful buyers and not so powerful sellers in the global South. So it was a completely asymmetrical system. By hyper-focusing on this kind of trade deficit is sort of, missing the point. The point is the entire system, whether it's a trade deficit or a trade surplus, ultimately feeds the imperial core and benefits the global North countries primarily. We see that sort of changing in 2005, 2006, when primarily driven by China, the consolidation in China, the development in China, it sort of changes the dynamics quite dramatically. So now you have, Trump's rolled out in the last hour that, today that China is going to have 145% tariffs. China is 84% tariffs on U.S. goods. And what that is actually, in 10% across the board, is trying to, it's a geopolitical tactic to try and roll out a kind of new Cold War to put pressure on China. The fact is that China has been prepared for this for at least the last 30, 40 years. That's why you have a diversification of their trade regime. They're hegemonic trade partners in many countries in Latin America, 54 countries in Africa, across Southeast Asia. They have the Belt and Road Initiative that embeds Chinese capital and investment across over 100 countries. And they've done, debt relief in over 70 countries in Africa. And the loans that they give out are between 3 and 4%, which is the same percentage that the U.S. loaned to Germany and Japan and Italy after World War II, part of the Marshall Plan. So it's a much different program than the U.S. has and had. And so what you'll see is not what the U.S. is expecting, which is countries abandoning China, which, China has 0% tariffs for most African countries and Latin American countries, but countries moving closer to China because there's an economic incentive to move closer to China.
I think that's a really good point. I mean, I was reading an article in the Chinese media a couple months ago that said if America isn't careful, they'll move themselves into regional party stature in terms of the regional power status in terms of the overall global order. And it seems like that's the case. And I guess I want your thoughts about whether, and I think maybe it's implied, but just to pull it out a little bit more, the possibility of this actually creating more jobs in the United States. I mean, this is, of course, how it's being sold by Trump, but it just doesn't seem like the dynamics are there for that possibility of, tens of millions of jobs or something coming back the way he's presenting it.
Look, if you're a capitalist and you're trying to start a factory in a country, the thing that you want most is stability, but you also need, built up infrastructure in America that's deteriorating. You need, workforces that are, invested in terms of, their education, etc., concentration of workers, all of the dynamics that you need, but you also need stability. So a tariff regime that you don't know it's going to exist in 10 years, 5 years, what you had in China and why companies were investing in China, especially in the Pearl River Delta region, was because they said, we have a 5-year plan, we have a 10-year plan, we have a 20-year plan that tells you that we're going to have this much stability. It makes sense to invest here. In the US, it doesn't make sense why a company would invest. I mean, maybe some companies that are secondary units, so like automobile companies, they might go to a supplier in Mexico. Those suppliers may invest in the US, or Foxconn, which produces exclusively for Apple. They may stop moving goods from China, where they're primarily based, and they also have facilities in Indonesia and South India and Brazil, and they have one facility in Wisconsin, so they might invest more in that Wisconsin facility to expand it. So you might see elements of that. But when most products, even that are made in America, 90% of the supply chain will be outside America, the effect will be an enormous cost to consumers. And I mean, this isn't a radical position. This is the position that of anybody with any economic understanding. There's no other way there's no other direction of travel. And this is something that, Trump has really been committed to this anti-tariff position since the 80s, when it was a kind of left-wing position. And now it's not necessarily a left-wing or right-wing position. It's just objectively the case that unless the state is investing in factories, which I don't see that happening anytime soon, capitalists are hugely disincentivized from investing in the US because of the volatility.
I think that's a really good point. And I mean, I think it speaks to a deeper question, too, about how we really build worker power, capitalism versus socialism, because I feel like so much of the conversation, at least here in the United States, is, you have to have tariffs if you want to have a strong working class. There's no way to actually expand the economy unless it's a beggar thy neighbor type policy, pitting workers here against workers in the global South. It's all, South Carolina versus, Sri Lanka or whatever it may be. But it seems like for like the working class, that is not really the standpoint to be looking at these sort of global geopolitical issues.
Look, there's two things that go here. We can't have a kind of writ large argument about workers, because right now, even if companies move to the US, they'll have huge tax incentives to do it, and the wages will be depressed. And there is some incentive necessary to expand in the US, and obviously those conditions might be better than, say, somewhere in Latin America. But the difference is about sector. So if you look at, the garment sector, those factory jobs coming to the US won't necessarily increase wages and mean better conditions. But if they, say, had targeted tariffs for, like, I don't know, the steel industry, that would benefit steel workers, because then they're not necessarily competing with other places, and they're not as movable. So, for example, in Britain, the fact that you've had these tariffs means that the steel industry is sort of going bankrupt. That's been privatized. Now the national government is talking about renationalizing it, right? They were talking about this yesterday. I don't know if that'll happen. That's a positive development. So renationalization is a positive development. What it means for workers' power, in certain sectors, it could increase workers' power because you have limited options for capitalists to undercut their wages. But in other sectors, it may not do that, because what it might mean is workers are also consumers. So, the price of goods going up, the asset prices falling, inflation being run away, has a negative impact on workers, especially if it doesn't lead to more investment in the real economy, which it doesn't seem like it will.
I'm glad you brought up the issue of the UK and policy there, because it seems like the UK and, of course, the EU is not exactly the same thing, of course, but are at sort of an inflection point here vis-a-vis their own relationships with China and the United States and others, of, whether they're going to try to, find a way to get along with Trump, or whether or not they, too, will embrace, working more collaboratively with China and other nations in the global South to, I don't know if isolate the U.S. is the right word, but at least to find a way to sort of get around this attempt to throw up a bunch of tariff walls.
That's one of the benefits, I think, of this tariffs. I mean, especially people who are more critical of the global order. Right now, you have an imperial bloc, which is Western countries, Europe, the US, Canada. This imperial bloc has geopolitical consequences. It has those consequences, say, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, potentially in the South China Sea with Taiwan. So geopolitically, a fissure between the imperial bloc, Europe, Canada, Australia, and the US has only positive outcomes, because if the US is trying to build a coalition to go bomb another country, it can't do it as easily. So they don't have that kind of hegemony to do that. The secondary point is that it has a much more interpersonal. Across Europe, they're boycotting goods from America. Canada, they're boycotting goods. This is a net positive, because the US has a hegemonic hold. So I think China is reaching out, for all evidence points to them reaching out to Europe, and Europe might be in more and more economic pressure. If China says, okay, we'll have no tariffs, and the US is saying we'll have 10% tariffs, increasingly parts of Europe may try to move closer to China, especially as it becomes less in their interest to be this kind of imperial bloc.
No, I think it's a good point, and just a couple more questions I want to ask you here. I mean, I wonder also how you think it could rebound on South Asia. I mean, it seems obviously, there's an attempt to kind of, India 29%, now China, 130% and counting, all these different pieces to sort of pit the different giants of South and East Asia against each other. But it also feels they have a lot of incentive to also to collaborate in this context. But obviously, India has its own, motivations, as does Pakistan and other countries, vis-a-vis how they relate to the United States. So I wonder how you see, insofar as we can see, this affecting the overall dance, if you will, between China and India around this, the concept of both countries rising or attempting to.
Well, look, Pakistan has historically been allied to the US. I mean, Imran Khan came in and tried to switch that. Now he's in a prison. So we don't know where that's going to go. In India, obviously, it's been 10, 11 years of the far-right government of Modi. Even though you would assume that they would become closer with the Americans, they actually have much closer ties with Russia. As Russia becomes closer to the US, that might also change that dynamic. And that, the jury's still out about that. With China, India fought 3 wars with China. They historically have had quite an antagonistic relationship with their border nation, but increasingly they've had increasing talks about over contested land. So those talks might lead to more stronger bilateral relations. So all of this is sort of up in the air. It's hard to know where India will fit in here. India's it's not a clear cut. It still has elements of that sort of non-aligned movement where they're not clearly with Washington, they're not clearly with Moscow, they're seeing where they can get the best probably trade agreement. So it's hard to say right now.
Mm-hmm. And just finally, real quick, Israel obviously had tariffs put against them by Trump. Netanyahu couldn't get them lifted, but we're seeing more. Their investment going into Israel is obviously going down because they're waging this genocide, and people don't know if it's a good investment. I mean, could there be some geoeconomic aspects to how the sort of the strength of the Israeli apartheid project that could come into play here in terms of the overall relationship of forces in West Asia, because so much of their economic model and the way it's integrated in with the West seems like it's also getting caught in some of these headwinds?
There's a few things here. So some of the arguments that people have said, why from the left, that people are saying, oh, Trump is doing this is to prevent de-dollarization. But the de-dollarization prevention argument doesn't make any sense because it's not targeted. So like you said, 17% for Israel, 10% for Iran. Obviously, they've now flattened that out to 10%. So that argument doesn't really make any sense. But what you see is the economy in the U.S. going down, weakening their relationships with other countries and allies, weakening. If we understand Israel as a proxy of the U.S., effectively a military base in the middle of piercing at a critical choke point, the African nations from the Asian countries, then the weakening of its imperial power and the economic power of the West and the strengthening of China. I mean, China doesn't have a hostile relationship with Israel, but they have a much more favorable relationship with Palestine. They've had all the factions meet in Beijing, the Palestinian factions. They had, they negotiated the peace agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, Syria under Assad and the Saudi Arabia. So they have a much more peaceful relationship to the Middle East. They're not as hostile or antagonistic as we'd like them to be with Israel, but they certainly are a much better, have a much better relationship to the Middle East. So the weakening of the U.S., the weakening of the imperial powers, the weakening of the U.S. economy, all potentially allows for a weakening potentially of Israel. So it's really, again, this is, they've now flattened it out. Iran has 10%, Israel has 10%. There's obviously lots of disinvestment that's happening in Israel. There's also been a brain drain recently. There was an article that talked about the brain drain that's happening in Israel. You also have the Yemen forces, Red Sea blockade that's having a negative effect, 20% increase cost for prices for any goods in Israel because it takes 2 weeks longer to go around the Horn of Africa. You also, just recently, the New York Times 4 days ago did an article about that the U.S. ballistic missiles and precision missile stockpiles are emptying because they're bombing Yemen so much. But the Pentagon anonymously officials said that they're being completely ineffectual. So the blockade is being quite effective. So all of these combination of forces, both meta forces and specific forces, could be putting medium, short-term pressure on Israel and hopefully longer-term pressure to really try and dent that economy.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot of different factors, a lot going on, and we really appreciate you being willing to join us here to help sort through it all amidst the chaos. Ashok, Kumar, thank you so much for some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me.